This panel is called Even Bernie Wants to Bomb Syria, Challenges to Anti-Imperialist, Anti-War Organizing Today. Has everyone gotten a copy of the paper? I'm sure, as you all know, this is a very timely panel. We can hear the war drums beating with greater intensity every day in all directions. And you know, the reason for the title was that all groups across the political spectrum are rallying behind these war efforts. Republicans, Democrats, and even so-called socialists are now getting in lockstep with the bourgeoisie. If you're not familiar, the strikes in Syria recently in April, the 59 Tomahawk missiles that hit a Syrian airbase, which Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross described as after-dinner entertainment for everyone gathered at Mar-a-Lago that day. Bernie endorsed that. He said that we were doing a good job. After-dinner entertainment. Even that kind of warmongering is supported by a so-called socialists. And that's not an isolated incident either. He also supports Trump's aggression with the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, or of Korea. So what is it about your socialist politics that would allow you to endorse war? That's what we're trying to get at here. And everyone here has their anti-war politics grounded, and their socialist politics, in anti-imperialism. That's the ground of our anti-war politics. And so this panel is going to go through what exactly imperialism is and what are the challenges to organizing as an anti-imperialist, right? So we have a really wonderful panel for you. I'm going to introduce them now. I'm John Steffin. I am with the Workers' World Party, and I'm an anti-war activist here in New York City. We have Abayomi Azikiwe, who is the editor at the Pan-African Newswire, and he's also part of the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, so he flew in all the way from Detroit. So we really thank him for doing that. To his left is Andrew Mayton, who came in from Baltimore. He's part of the Baltimore Anti-Fascist Community Defense and Baltimore Asian Resistance and Solidarity. Hello, thank you so much for coming. We're just getting through the introductions here. And then at the end of the table we have Taryn Fivik, who is part of the International Action Center and is also the author of the novella Spooks. You should check it out. So, and she's actually going to be talking about kind of what that novella is about. So, again, the title is Challenges to Anti-Imperialist Organizing Today. We've identified 3 different areas that we think are the challenges to this kind of organizing. One is there's confusion about what exactly imperialism is, right? So Abayomi and I are going to talk about this and kind of provide the theoretical basis for this panel and for anti-imperialist politics. And we're going to give examples of non-imperialist actors and how they act and how they compare to imperialist actors. So I'll be talking about Russia, and Abayomi is going to talk about China, among other things. And then the other thing is that anti-war sentiments are popular, but how do we connect this to anti-imperialist politics, to really make anti-imperialism at the forefront of our struggles in the streets? And Andrew's really going to give us that kind of on-the-ground activist side of things. And then finally, Taryn's going to round us out with a discussion about the media and how there is almost zero coverage, almost zero critical coverage of this warmongering, this aggression, these wars. It's barely talked about in our media, and she's going to not just provide an analysis of why these journalists have drank the Kool-Aid, but like give a real material analysis of why journalists are not writing about these things. So I will start us, throughout we have put together a handout that is a definition, Lenin's definition of imperialism, which we draw on for inspiration to analyze today's conditions. He had 5 points in his pamphlet Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So that's the 5 points that are listed. And then we've gone through and drawn out some quotes that elaborate on that. Lenin in 1916 wrote a popular pamphlet called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. That was over 100 years ago today, but it still offers crucial insights into our times because we are still in the imperialist stage of capitalism. The system is in a far greater state of decay, but imperialism is still a defining feature of the capitalist system today. So I'm going to give you a quick definition of imperialism that was written by a comrade, U.S. communist Vince Copeland, in a short pamphlet from 1969 called Expanding Empire. He says, the investment of capital in a foreign country should be regarded something like sending a huge suction pump there, which pulls out the metals from the ground, the products from the soil, and the fruits from the trees, with the help, of course, of the labor of the native people working on this suction pump. It is as if the pump were connected to pipes that run back to the home country via the banks and big corporations. All the rich products are showered from the pipes into the treasuries of these institutions in the form of profits. Whole nations are drained by these great suction pumps, and the profits are so great that rival groups of big business, led by small cliques of big banks, go to war with each other over the exploitation of these nations. So, corporations here in the United States, they're looking for profit. They can no longer find it within the borders of the United States. They begin to look elsewhere. And I'm going to do like a little bit more of a dive into what this is. So it's simple enough to understand, but how exactly do we get here? And that's where Lenin's definition comes in, kind of takes you through the development into imperialism from capitalism. So the first point that he makes is basically that industry concentrates into the hands of the few. So over the last several centuries, capitalists have been producing the same goods and fighting for the same shares of markets, right? So capitalist who's producing iron ore. At first, there's maybe 100 or maybe 1,000, but slowly over time, a couple pull ahead of the rest, and there's maybe only 1, 2, 3 major producers of this particular good, like iron, right? There's a couple different ways in which one capitalist group can pull ahead of the other. One is that they can exploit their workers more by working them harder, working longer hours, or they can come up with new technologies that'll help them to produce more goods for less. So when you're selling cheaper goods, more people are going to buy it because more people can afford it and they don't want to buy the more expensive stuff. And the companies that can't keep up go out of business. They're bought out by these other capitalists, and the industry concentrates into what's called a monopoly, right? And it gets to such a point that this actually impacts the field of competition. So there is a point, as this quote from Lenin says, that it almost basically becomes a mafia type situation where these different groups are making agreements with each other about prices. They set the price and they split up the turf, right? So you don't sell there, I won't sell here, we're just gonna keep what we got going here. The second point is that there's a parallel trend of concentration in the banking system. So while fewer and fewer capitalists are controlling more and more of the markets, it's the same with the banks. Fewer and fewer banks are holding the assets of fewer and fewer monopolists. The banks then play a critical role in evaluating the most profitable investment for all the capitalists because they hold the assets the industrialists are producing. So this leads to a merger of the banks and industry into finance capital. And there's also a merger of the state. So the state provides the military because obviously if you want to sell your goods outside of the country, you need to make sure that that other country wants you to or wants to buy it, so you force them to buy it. You open up these markets, and it's been like this throughout the history of capitalism that we've taken the warships into different parts of the world and told them like, we will kill you if you do not buy, our cheap iron or whatever, The third point, instead of selling goods to foreign countries, industrialists in alliance with the banks decide that all their money would best be spent abroad. So this is the export of capital. This is critical. We're not just selling iron to these countries. We're actually giving them financial means for creating factories in their own countries. But what's important to note is that when a monopoly lends money to these other countries, it's not in their best interest because there's strings attached. And the monopoly determines how that country is going to spend it. So they're going to determine which commodities it makes, right? Among other things. And the reason it does this is because, it finds in places like Africa and Latin America, places that hadn't yet been developed by capitalism, that there was, cheaper land, cheaper labor, cheaper raw materials. It becomes overall profitable because those three items have become more expensive in the home countries, right? So as Lenin reminds us, the home market is inevitably bound up with the foreign market. That's when these foreign markets are developed for the profit of the monopolists in the home country. So to give an example, as I said back in the day, this might be determining which commodities a country produces. So like, okay, this country in Latin America is only going to produce bananas, and they're dependent on the sales of those bananas in order to have enough money to sustain themselves, and if the banana economy tanks, their economy tanks. And today, it's a little different. You can see this example with what happened with Syria, right, in Greece. So Syriza goes to Brussels and says, hey, can we get, maybe a better deal on how we're paying back our debts to you? And, they say, no, fuck you, you're going to pay us back our debts. And so then Syriza, even though the people would not like to be part of this these austerity measures, Syriza goes back and starts cutting social services and carrying out the will of Brussels, and the EU against the wishes of the Syrian people. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork of imperialism and how it functions, we can start to understand economic and political developments today. And I'm going to look at Russia really quickly, maybe in 3 minutes. So Russia is an important state to analyze when making sense of imperialism, particularly today as events develop in Syria. Russia has stepped into the Syrian conflict to defend Assad. And many folks on the left have seen this as a symptom of so-called Russian imperialism. So they're saying that Russia is acting as an imperialist state. But stepping into a military conflict abroad does not prove that Russia is imperialist. Based on Lenin's definition, to prove Russia is imperialist, we would need to show how Russia uses its quote-unquote superabundance of capital in order to exploit other countries, economically and militarily. So we need to look at Russia's finances, and particularly how many assets it has abroad, how much money it's making abroad. So if you just take a quick glance at Russia's financial assets, you'll see that it will not be subjugating another country anytime soon. A 2013 study of the top 20 non-financial Russian multinational enterprises gives a figure for their total foreign assets at the end of 2011 at $111 billion. Top 20 non-financial Russian multinationals. If you compare this to GE, a US multinational, that only accounts for 1/3 of how much GE owns in foreign assets. And that's 20 Russian multinational enterprises equates to 1/3 of a US multinational. So you can really see the difference in the scale of their economies. Another thing to note is even Russia itself doesn't project much growth in its foreign financial assets. Sberbank, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, Sberbank in 2014, which accounts for 29% of Russian banking assets and considers itself the quote-unquote circulatory system of the Russian economy. So a big player in the Russian economy, only projected growth in foreign assets to comprise 5% of its net income. And 5% would be about 11 billion, which is compared to a bank like Wells Fargo in the US, which has made $80 million, or $80 billion in that same period. So 11 billion versus 80 billion. It's a huge difference. And then on top of this, if you look at where most Russia central bank foreign direct investment is, which countries it's in Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands, which, as we all know, are notorious tax havens. So they're not actually developing with that money. It's just idling, waiting for profitable investment, right? So what is Russia doing with these meager foreign assets, right? I think a great example is what happened in 2014 with the events around Euromaidan, right? You can see how Russia is on the defensive in there. It's not in control of the situation. The EU is in the control of the situation. So before 2014, the Ukraine had deep economic ties to Russia. But it also had ties to the EU. It was about 50-50, and the trade that it had with Russia was mostly in the high-tech sector. So helicopters and other big equipment. Around this time, 2012, 2013, Ukraine was entering into negotiations of entering the EU. The EU was very firm in its stance that if you want to enter the EU, you can no longer trade with Russia. In effect, you can no longer have 50% of your trade going elsewhere. It all needs to come to us. And President Yanukovych at first waffled. You know, there was 50% of his economy was telling him, don't do that deal. That's not good. That's not good for us. And he was ousted for that. And he was ousted, it's important to note, by the EU. It was not Russia that stepped in to control the situation. They couldn't. They don't have the military capacity to do that. But the EU does. It can fund these foreign mercenaries. And, you know, for the longest time, since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's been housing these fascist parties, which it sent out there and took lead, I believe, right? And these parties are called Pravi Sektor, which means right sector, and Svoboda, which is the national Ukrainian party. So these parties are leading this movement called Euromaidan for European integration. And they're fascists. They are fascists. Russia is on the defense against this. It is under attack. And now that the Ukraine has shifted to the EU, it's lost a huge trading partner. You know, it already has so little foreign assets, so little foreign trade that it's had that taken away from it now, you know. And so it is clear to Russia now that it is not going to get the same treatment that Japan and Germany got after World War II. It thought when the Soviet Union fell, it would become capitalist, it would be embraced by the imperialists and be made into an imperialist power. It's not. It's being bullied. It's getting all of its trading partners stripped away from it by the EU. And so this is also going on in Syria. Syria is a major trading partner with Russia, and the U.S. is also trying to take it away. So this is all, you know, can be pretty heady theoretical stuff, you know, and maybe it's happening elsewhere. So, well, you know, can it help us with on-the-ground organizing? You know, that's a big question. And yes, it is absolutely important that we have proper analysis of these international developments and where Russia fits in the world system. So take, for example, the anti-fascist, I know I'm running over time, but just 2 paragraphs. The anti-fascist resistance in Donbass, right? We can see how the struggle is made possible exactly because Russia is not imperialist. As a semi-periphery state, Russia cannot afford to lose all ties with Ukraine to the imperialist West. And so when an anti-fascist struggle that's fighting these right-wing parties that are leading Euromaidan breaks out in territory on Russia's border, Russia is forced to defend it for a variety of reasons. 1, it doesn't want to lose all these economic ties. 2, there's a lot of popular sentiment in Russia to keep Ukraine a part of, you know, Russia. Crimea has a lot of Russian nationals in it. They don't want to lose that. And a lot of these people in these areas know that when they go to the EU, they're fucked. You know, like, it's not going to be beneficial to their economy. So they're going to fight like hell. And, you know, so then Russia steps in and it defends it. And there's a lot of progressive elements in Donbass. There's communists, there's socialists. And so Russia ends up being forced into playing a somewhat progressive role by defending them against these fascist hordes. So, you know, if we were to conflate Russian imperialism with U.S. imperialism, we wouldn't see the strategic advantage. Donbass would not be possible, but it was and it still is. And in the U.S. context, an understanding of Russia has become critical as the Democrats attempt to criticize Trump for supposed ties to Russia. Rather than saying, you know, fight racism at home, the Democrats are hoping to use this opportunity to not only depose Trump, but whip up enthusiasm for war with Russia, because we are bullying Russia, and it is the objective of some parts of the U.S. ruling class to totally subjugate the Russian oligarchy. So, in closing, the contradictions of the ruling class should be taken advantage of by the left. We can only do this if we have a proper analysis of these contradictions. So, thank you.